Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much for joining us here for this Rock Center event. It is truly an extraordinary honor and privilege to have with us this evening two of the leading law enforcement people in the United States. As a personal matter, I do hope that none of you ever have the occasion to meet either of these two people in their professional capacity, because if you ever do meet Ms. Harris or Mr. Bharara in their professional capacity, it will be one of the worst days of your life. I can guarantee that will definitely be the case. Notwithstanding the fact that we have two participants who need no introduction, I am compelled to offer an introduction, and I trust you will forgive me. Kamala Harris is the 32nd Attorney General of the great state of California. She's the first woman, the first African American, and the first South Asian to hold the office in the history of California. As California's top lawyer and chief law enforcement officer, Attorney General Harris is focused on combating transnational gangs. Local gangs, not tough enough for her, all right? She needs the international gangs. Increasing the adoption of technology by law enforcement, defending California consumers and homeowners, preserving California's natural resources, ensuring marriage equality for all Californians, and protecting Californians' online privacy. On behalf of California's homeowners, Ms. Harris has secured an estimated $18 billion from the nation's biggest banks as part of the recent national mortgage settlement, including $12 billion in principal reductions. Ms. Harris has partnered with tech giants Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Google, Hewlett-Packard, Microsoft, and Rembe to improve privacy in mobile applications. She's brought together the online dating companies of eHarmony, Match, and Spark to keep registered sex offenders off their sites. Ms. Harris has been a leader on human trafficking, sponsoring California's first felony human trafficking law in 2005. And last year, she partnered with Yahoo and Microsoft to raise awareness against human trafficking online. Ms. Harris has created California's first dedicated high-tech crimes unit. She's created California's first privacy unit to innovatively enforce federal and state privacy laws. She's recognized as one of the nation's top regulators when it comes to technology and privacy. Otherwise, there's absolutely nothing to commend Ms. Harris to your I don't know. Preet Bharara, all right, is the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. The joke among lawyers is the Southern District of New York is really the sovereign district of New York, that it has extraordinary discretion and a very, very broad reach in terms of the cases that it brings and, dare I say, the toughness with which it prosecutes these cases. Mr. Bharara supervises an office of more than 450 employees, including more than 200 assistant United States attorneys, who are, by the way, some of the most accomplished and toughest prosecutors that we have in the United States. Preet is a member of the Attorney General's Advisory Committee and serves as chair of its subcommittee on white-collar fraud. Preet is also co-chair of the Securities and Commodities Fraud Working Group of the Interagency Financial Fraud Enforcement Task Force. He oversees numerous criminal and civil cases, including groundbreaking financial fraud and insider trading prosecutions, historic international terrorism cases, and the resolution of alleged civil rights violations at various public venues. I think it's fair to say that most recently, Mr. Bharara's office is best known for the work on the insider trading cases. Does anybody here in this room know how many insider trading trials the U.S. Attorney for the Sovereign District of New York has lost? How many criminal? Zero. That's exactly right. If you wind up being sued by Preet, you will go to jail, all right, courtesy of Preet. So it's really nice when there's no ambiguity, and it can make a conversation with a client fairly clear when you're saying, look, you got a problem, all right, you know, you've got an indictment, it's Preet's signature on the bottom over there. We know how this game plays out. Maybe we should have a conversation. The Rajaratnam trial and the Gupta trials were both successfully prosecuted by Preet's office. Rajaratnam will be serving, let's see, how many years? What do we have? Anybody know? 13. How many? What else? I have 13 bid. What else do I have? 11. We have a winner. It's 11 years. Okay, we could play it like The Price is Right. Whoever comes closest without going over, it's exactly right. And also the former CEO, Mr. Gupta, the former CEO of McKinsey, very sadly also has been convicted of insider trading. And he is serving how many years? 2 years, that's exactly right. So he will be a guest of the federal government for 2 years. Also, Preet's office has had remarkable success, I think surprising success, pursuing crimes, cyber crimes in foreign venues. Most recently, there was an action that was brought against the developers of the Gozi virus, which attacked financial institutions around the world, and arrests have been made in Riga, Latvia, and in Bucharest, Romania, of a Mr. Denis Karlovskis and Mihai Paunescu, and I believe that Mr. Kuzmin is in custody. You have him as a...
Correct.
He's a guest of yours in New York.
Yes.
You're showing him the appropriate hospitality.
Yes, low-rent guest.
He's a low-rent guest. That's exactly right. He is a former citizen of Moscow, Russia. So one of the things that maybe we'll get into is how does the United States Attorney actually wind up with Russian citizens as a house guest in Manhattan, and how do we get people from Latvia and Romania extradited back to the United States because of their activities on the web. In his spare time, he pursues narco-terrorists, narcotics trafficking, money laundering, and under his supervision, the office has also been very aggressive combating corruption by city, state, and federal officials and contracting violations in the New York area. Before becoming the United States Attorney, Preet was chief counsel and staff director of the Senate Judiciary's Subcommittee on Administrative Oversights of the Court, and he also previously was an assistant United States Attorney in the Southern District of New York. Ladies and gentlemen, if we could welcome two of the most accomplished prosecutors in the United States. Now, we really could talk about just any topic imaginable, but we won't. We're going to try to focus specifically on issues related to cybercrime and corporate America. And let me begin with a rather general question. What do the two of you see as the most significant cyber threats to corporate America today? Where's the real big risk?
Well, I'll start. And let me just start by first thanking Stanford and Professor for hosting us. It's a great honor for me to be here, but in particular to be next to my colleague, the U.S. Attorney from the Southern District of New York. He really is not only what you read about in public, but just among prosecutors considered to be one of the leaders of our country. So welcome to California, and thank you for being here. The way that I approach the issue, generally speaking, I must start by saying, just to put my comments in context, is from two perspectives. One is probably with a little bravado as a very proud Californian, and very proud of the technology that is changing the world, that is really being created for the most part right here in our backyard. I am the daughter of a scientist. I grew up going to the lab with her on weekends, and she had two things she wanted to do in this world: raise her two daughters and end breast cancer. And so I grew up around, and it's in my DNA, this idea that we can do anything and we can create anything being unburdened by what has been or what has not been able to be accomplished. So I'm very excited about the technology that we have created that is changing the world. I also approach this perspective of what is going on with technology from the perspective of a career prosecutor. From my very first job out of law school with the Alameda County DA's office until today, my entire career has been dedicated to making sure that vulnerable people are kept safe, that voiceless people have a voice, and that those that commit a violation of our laws will face consequence and accountability, and it should be severe and it should be swift as appropriate. So on this issue of cybersecurity, in particular, what we think about and talk about is the issue of privacy and what needs to be done to protect privacy and information. Information that is being taken essentially without the permission of the holder of that information. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we face to that end is a lack of understanding about how technology works, and therefore how this information can be procured against one's interest, but also against one's preference. I look at it from a perspective of realizing that most people don't know how technology works. I look at it from a perspective of thinking about how businesses operate and realizing that there is an incredible amount of data that is accumulated in those businesses, but that, as we say, the chain is going to be as strong as each of its links. And for many business models, we have not yet integrated into the model how we make sure that each of those links will be strong and in that way create a strong chain. I think about the issue in terms of public information about what they're giving up and what information is available through the many entry points that we now have. When we think about it in terms of the typical work that a prosecutor would do if there was a bank robbery, we would first look at, okay, there are only going to be certain points of entry, probably the front door and the back door. Well, now when we look at using that metaphor, how a robber can rob the resources and what is valuable inside that bank, there are many points of entry. And so part of what has to be done to create safety in this world is to think about all those different entry points and have a plan that is about protocols, it's about a plan and also training for ensuring that each of those entry points is gated and is made safe so that those intruders cannot come in and steal what is valuable. So those are my general thoughts about it, and I'm sure we'll get into more detail.
Preet?
I also am honored and thrilled to be here, and I want to thank the professor and Stanford for hosting me as a guest from 3,000 miles away, and also want to reiterate what, and return the compliment, because it is really an honor to be here with Kamala Harris, who everyone in California should be really grateful and happy that they have such a leader who has been a person who, for her entire professional career, has dedicated herself to public safety and issues of fairness and justice. And so it's an honor to be here with you also. One of the things that the Attorney General said a second ago resonates with me, because it is sometimes the case that people who are in charge of law enforcement efforts and people who are in charge of making sure that their companies are secure don't know a lot about how information operates, don't know a lot about how the internet works, don't know a lot about how cybersecurity can be affected. I consider myself to have been one of those people and learned a lot on the job, which is odd because it turns out my name is Preet. People sometimes ask me what kind of name that is, and obviously I was born in India, and it's an Indian name, and of course Preet is ancient Sanskrit for cyber fighter. So you would think that I would have come right into the job knowing exactly what to do. The problem is that Bharara is also Sanskrit for Luddite. So it sort of canceled each other out. So part of the problem, not only on the part of professionals at corporations who have to worry about cybersecurity, but on the part of people in government, is there's a learning curve, and I'm learning every day more things about the threat that's out there and the ways in which we can all work together to do something about that threat. More specifically, in addition to all the privacy concerns that I echo completely that the Attorney General talked about, we have national security concerns. There are nation states who are out there who are trying to do things to attack not only our infrastructure, but also corporations and also stock exchanges. We have financial institutions that on a regular basis are getting bombarded by folks who are not just single actors from an Eastern European country, but who are backed by enemies of the United States on a regular basis. And that's something we have to be concerned about. There are also people who, as evidenced by the case that the professor mentioned in his introduction, that we dealt with in the Southern District of New York, who are trying to literally rob people's bank accounts by the click of a mouse and from a distance of thousands and thousands of miles. The problem is there's no monolithic threat emanating from one particular source that is coming upon us in one particular way. So one of the biggest problems is that there are so many threats happening in so many different directions that it is sometimes hard to get control of the problem. And whether you're talking about corporate espionage, or you're talking about the invasion of our bank accounts or the invasion of our privacy, it's a threat that needs to be dealt with not just by the national security community, not just by prosecutors in the federal system, but also by prosecutors in the state system and prosecutors in the local system, and also, more importantly, to the point that brings us here today, by corporate America also. It seems like an obvious thing that in this area where a lot of the harm can be done to corporations and to people who rely on corporations, whether they're banks or otherwise, and they have their money in those corporations, that a partnership and a robust and open and honest dialogue between corporate America and law enforcement, it would seem obvious that makes sense. And I'll just end my my introductory answer by saying that the problem is that's not always so obvious. There was a gentleman by the name of Marcus Rainham, and I don't know this gentleman, but he is, I understand, the chief of security for a company called Tenable Security, and this is what he said at a recent Black Hat conference. He said, quote, "I lose my cool when I hear people from government, or formerly from the government, say the private sector needs to step up. Providing for the common defense is what the government is supposed to do." And I respectfully suggest, and I don't know this gentleman, that he should perhaps change the name of his company from Tenable Security to Untenable Security. Because clearly it's the case that we have more work to do. And the good news is that industry and government in both Northern California and in New York and a lot of different places are doing a much better job of talking to each other, are doing a much better job of figuring out ways that they can disclose while at the same time maintaining their corporate secrets and maintaining the privacy of people's accounts. We have a lot more work to do, but we're not going to get a lot of progress, so we're not going to keep our country safer and our infrastructure safer and our accounts safer with the attitude like the gentleman that I just quoted from.
So if you review the publicly available information from the United States government having to do with threat assessments and the U.S. economy, you'll find a lot of stuff about threats to infrastructure, about how the electrical grid can be brought down, threats to the water supply system. You can go down the list. You find a lot of information about potential threats to the financial system, about what can be done to our banking. And look, our financial system currently exists through electronic entries on large databases. That's where our money is. It's not folding bills or blocks of gold in vaults anywhere. It's a computer-based modern financial system, and therefore it's potentially at risk. A large amount of sensitive information exists in the form of medical records. Huge amounts of intellectual property are online, and there's reason to believe that much of it has already been, how shall I say, borrowed from a variety of foreign sources, including a country that I often call Fredonia, because it doesn't like being mentioned. And then you've got the national security risk, that a lot of these intrusions actually occur by people that want to do us harm, and in the event we ever get involved in a kinetic situation, they might be able to use some of the information that they otherwise gather. So this is just a rough outline of the types of threats that we face. And let me put this question to you. What are you guys doing to make us safe against that? What are some of the law enforcement strategies that you're employing to combat these threats?
Look, as I said a minute ago, it's a dangerous and developing threat that doesn't come from one source or even from one country and doesn't even target one particular area of vulnerability. So to speak broadly, what I think the government is trying to do and has had some success in doing is engaging in what I refer to as a practice of engagement. And it's engaging local communities, it's engaging the private sector, it's engaging our law enforcement partners in other parts of the world. As is evidenced by the case that's now been mentioned a couple of times, a lot of the threat is not coming from within the United States, but it's coming in over the internet from people who are in far-flung places like China and Latvia and Russia and other places. And the only way you're going to be able to get at the problem and identify the people who are engaging in the attacks on American businesses and American infrastructure is to have strong relations with those abroad. So one of the things that we've done in our office is have assistant U.S. attorneys working alongside the FBI and the Secret Service to do a lot of international outreach, because a growing problem is going to be the international aspect of this. And every country has a different rule about extradition. Every country has a different rule about how they can conduct investigations in their country, and a different practice with how much they cooperate with us and how much information is shared. And part of the issue is one of diplomacy. It's not just a black and white law enforcement matter, but figuring out how you're going to get various countries in which there are people who are perpetrating these crimes against citizens in this country to cooperate with us. And there's no one size fits all, but probably one of the most important things we're doing is engaging industry directly through forums like this, and engaging our foreign law enforcement partners on a regular basis as well.
Kamala?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's a three-legged stool, and the legs are corporations and the industry, and industry in general, government and individuals. And speaking for government, I'd say that we need to strengthen that leg for sure, and we're going to do it in a number of ways. It's going to be through the outreach and the collaboration with industry that Preet was describing. It's also going to be just paying attention to the mundane detail that is always essential to actually implementing a great plan. And so that's when I would talk about the fact that, frankly, government is obsolete in many ways when it comes to the adoption of technology. And to the extent that we as prosecutors at the federal and at the state level have an interest in just understanding that the landscape includes the international component and it just includes what's happening in our backyard, we have to strengthen law enforcement at every branch, local, state, federal, and all of the work we do internationally. And so on that point, let's talk about the mundane detail. When I became district attorney of San Francisco in 2004, not very long ago, and this is a first-class city, 2/3 of my lawyers did not have email. The San Francisco Police Department is just rolling out email. Last year, I just bought for the California Department of Justice Outlook, right? So when we're talking about this grand, big subject of how we're going to deal with cybersecurity, part of what we're going to have to focus on is the mundane detail of how we're going to assist government to adopt technology in a way that we can have the tools that are necessary to actually fight these threats to our country and our state and our neighborhoods. To that end, one of the things that we started last year is I started a pilot. It's actually, I haven't talked in the press about it because it's a pilot, so we're working out all the kinks. But essentially what we're doing is we are creating, on the crime lab model, forensic digital labs. I started one in Fresno, the second one we're rolling out in Sacramento. And the point there is to create the expertise and have the tools, the actual tools that law enforcement can use to deal with issues like identity theft. Because of course the tools are there, they're available, they'll decrease the amount of time and the dollars we're spend on that investigator on the street. But they don't have it naturally in most police departments. Most police departments do not have a division that is focused on technology and crimes that are committed through the use of technology or just the way that we can solve crimes with technology. So that is part of the issue in the way that I think of it. But it is also doing the work and continuing to do the work of collaboration with industry and sitting down and talking about ways that we can work together and also developing, frankly, relationships of trust, which is essential. And that's essential, I say, as a career prosecutor, if you're talking about a homicide or if you're talking about this issue, which is making sure that the victim and the witnesses feel and know that they can trust us as prosecutors, the way that they will believe that justice will be done and that they will not be unnecessarily hurt, harmed, or damaged as a result of their cooperation with us. And so that relates specifically to what is not necessarily an elephant in the room, it's a challenge for us, which is having companies and corporations, when they have been hacked, when they have been victimized, having them come forward and share that information with law enforcement so that, one, we can make sure there's consequence and accountability for the wrongdoer, but also so that we can engage in whatever is necessary around prevention and deterrence and all of the other core traditional focuses that we have as prosecutors and law enforcement.
Well, let's follow up on this question of trust for a moment, because I know as a matter of fact that it's a real issue, challenge, and problem for both of you, because for a variety of different reasons, many corporations decide that when they've been hacked, the last thing in the world they want to do is have anybody know that they've been hacked. And even though the world might be a better place, if they picked up the phone and if they called either of the two of you and said, look, we've got a problem, the tendency is for many corporations to take these events and sweep it under the rug, all right? Unless it becomes of a magnitude like the Sony PlayStation thing where this is we don't have a rug big enough that we can sweep this under. When you run out of rug, all right, you then call, all right, one of the two of you guys. What steps are you taking to try to persuade corporations that perhaps their current recalcitrant behavior is not in their best interest or society's best interest?
What I say to them quite bluntly is in a day and an age when the threat is at the level that it's at and where so many people are in a position to be suffering, and so many more people can be suffering, and our infrastructure is at risk. The days that you thought you could get away with not disclosing the information are over. And if you still have a concern about dealing with law enforcement, the three-word message is get over it, because you're not doing yourself any long-lasting, you're not helping yourself in a long-term way, because if you're in the business that my folks are in, our job is to try to prevent the problem in the future, and the way we do it, fundamentally, speaking very plainly, is to get the bad guys. And the bad guys who are perpetrating the intrusions and who are engaging in the fraud and who are taking down companies and stealing people's credit card information are going to keep doing it unless they are caught. And it's a hard enough thing in this area, harder than almost any other area that I deal with, and I don't want to speak for the Attorney General, but I'm guessing that she deals with also, because not only is it hard to find people who are out of the country who are doing us harm, but identifying them behind a veil of secrecy through various mechanisms that anonymize them in the internet. And so a company can get away with perhaps not disclosing something that day, but that's not going to prevent them from being hacked again from the same source the next day, and all of their colleagues in that same industry the day after. And so it's not only the case that we try to tell industry that it's the right thing to do, it's in their self-interest to do, but it's also in the self-interest of the industry at large to figure out ways to cooperate and disclose. I'll give you an example that was mentioned to me by some very smart person in Silicon Valley who focuses on these issues. Who's
We're
a professor
all
at Stanford.
smart people at Silicon Valley.
By definition.
That didn't narrow it down.
I come here to feel stupid. And he said, look, if you look at another area where industry benefits and the public safety is benefited by the sharing of information, he gave a very simple example that has stuck with me last time I was in Silicon Valley. And he said, when an airplane crashes, an investigation is done, and people understand what the mechanism was that caused the plane to crash, and people perhaps died in that plane crash, and no matter what the airline was that flew the jet, or the manufacturer was who made the jet, everybody in that industry gets an understanding of, because of the investigation and the information shared, gets an understanding of what went wrong with the wiring or the mechanism, so that more people don't die from that problem. And in some ways, problems, and I'm speaking a little bit out of school, problems that cause planes to crash are simple matters compared to the ways in which people from outside the country are attempting to hack into our accounts and into our infrastructure. And so if it can happen in the one area, and everybody understands very clearly that that makes sense, and we can protect the public, and we can protect entire industries by sharing information, obviously, you have to work on ways that you can share information that don't compromise the trade secrets of the companies and that don't compromise the privacy of the individuals who have information at those companies, but that can be done. And just another positive note, there's an informal sharing arrangement among financial institutions in my district, among banks, because each of them realizes there's much greater strength in the group in sharing information and fighting against the cyber threat than there is each man or each bank for himself or itself. And that, I think, is a model that should be taken to other areas of the country and to broader industry. I think it's still not the way that it should be, and it's not as advanced as it should be. But I think smart people, the best part about the example I've described to you is that was not mandated by the government. Nobody issued a subpoena. Nobody got a court order to require them to share information. There was no executive order. Industry decided over time, it took them a while to do so, that it was in their self-interests and in their financial interests to pool their resources together and to share information, and I think it's worked fairly effectively in New York.
And just an aside, law firms, in my view, are particularly vulnerable because they often have very valuable information. And I'll be polite, law firms are not the best organizations at cybersecurity, all right?
And let's talk about the connection between law firms then and the client they represent.
Absolutely.
Because the client, the company, the corporation may have put in place all of the appropriate walls and methods for safety, but the lawyer has their information.
Correct.
And the cyber criminal has already figured that out, and there are cases of that, where they will then get the corporation by going through the law firm, which has not put in all of the appropriate points of contact to make sure that, as I was saying earlier, that those weak links in the chain are not there and not present.
The Attorney General is absolutely right. You can think of the equivalent of an information supply chain, and if you're trying to get information, you go to the weakest link in that chain.
That's right.
And the weakest link in that chain can easily be the law firm.
Because the law firm's going to have all the information, all the confidential information, all the client information that will be the subject of great value if someone were to steal it.
So two anecdotes. It's, for example, publicly known that information about how much Coca-Cola was willing to pay for a Chinese juice company was actually borrowed by some sources in China. And Coca-Cola then, because the other side knew what the top dollar was that it was willing to pay, the other side knew what the negotiating strategy was. Coca-Cola, well, we don't know cause and effect, but we do know that after Coca-Cola learned that its key bidding information had been borrowed, they ceased the negotiations and they didn't go forward with the transaction. There's another transaction where, again, representatives of the same country borrowed information from a law firm about bidding strategy. There, the transaction had to go forward, and the law firm responded by going back to faxes and telephone to communicate the information. And the faxes that you had to use were not the ones that show up on your computer screen, because that would have been hacked as well. Rather, they went back to the good old kind of, digital fax where you feed the paper in and the paper comes
Short
out.
of a mimeograph.
That's exactly. And then there are the smoke signals, okay? So far they have not figured out how to hack the smoke signals, but it's really a very intriguing back to the future situation. And how companies and individuals respond to some of these situations.
But just as a point of emphasis, I think it's very important for those of you who are here and representing a client, your business, it is completely understandable from our perspective that the business would not want to share that information, that a business does not want to be perceived as vulnerable. It's completely understandable. But we've got to figure out a way to deal with that, because the reality of it is that it's not about you, frankly, because you're not the only one, is what I mean by that. Once you've been hit, if they think they're getting away with it, they're going to hit others. I mean, there is a component and an aspect of this that is really predatory in nature. And so in that, there's not going to be just one victim. So it goes on. So this is, and we have the tools in law enforcement, and Preet can talk to you about what he has at the federal level, what we have at the state level. For example, Preet mentioned if what would potentially be disclosed are trade secrets. Well, we have legal mechanisms to make sure that that is kept confidential. There are often, especially if we're talking about warrants, there has to be some kind of judicial review before certain information is received. So there are opportunities to really modify and make sure that there is not just a whole sweep of your information when we're trying to make sure that there's a consequence for a predator.
And it would probably be in everyone's best interest if both of you could figure out how to message these assurances more effectively, because the general perception, among GCs and boards of directors and executives is when you have one of these problems, you want to keep the government as far away from you as possible. You want to resolve the problem internally with as little press as possible. Again, all perfectly understandable. You're asking organizations to perform unnatural acts by coming to you. Right. And the government is going to need to figure out a more effective and credible strategy for persuading businesses to do that. You're not there yet.
What are your suggestions? Do you have suggestions?
Yeah, I've got a few suggestions.
Let's talk.
So number one, can you make firm and binding commitments that would, as a practical matter, give comfort to corporations when they come forward? So one of the concerns is, once you give information to the government, you have absolutely no control over what the government decides to do with it. All right? If you think something terrible has happened and you say, gee, I want the U.S. Attorney or the Attorney General to come in, all right, and I give them that information, you as the company can't tell the government what to do with that information. It's totally out of your control as a legal matter. And that scares people.
Right, but I think what has to happen is people appreciate the element that causes relationships to work, and that's something that Kamala mentioned in her introductory remarks, and that is trust. every relationship, whether it's between people who are dating or it's between industry and law enforcement, has to be based on trust. And in part, that trust gets developed over a period of time and based on examples of the trust being tested. And I think we're in a better position than we were, but one of the ways that trust gets established is for industry and law enforcement together to figure out ways to talk about the issue before they arise.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of having relationships between parties, particularly ones who are not naturally drawn to each other, in times of fair weather, right? The worst thing that can happen is the company who's never talked to law enforcement and has a natural predisposition against disclosing for all the structural and personality reasons that you might imagine, doesn't know. And I've talked to CEOs of companies and people who are on boards of directors, and I say, well, what are you going to do when you get that phone call and you find out about an intrusion or a hack? And a surprising number of them don't know who the human being is, not just in their own company necessarily who would take the lead, but who the human being is that human being needs to call at law enforcement to say, you're not going to believe this, it's 1 o'clock in the morning. We have shareholders to worry about, we have customers to worry about, we have the SEC to worry about potentially, we have law enforcement to worry about, and we have our own business to worry about. And they don't know, and it's a weird phone call to make for the first time to the unknown faceless FBI agent in the middle of the night who you've not met before. So the one piece of advice, if there's any piece of advice I could give to people who represent industry, who are in industry, is figure out today in advance what your plan is and who you're going to talk to, and have a meeting with that person, and chances are you will be pleasantly surprised that they have gotten much more sophisticated in ways that they can make not necessarily ironclad binding commitments in a particular area, but assurances that they are sensitive to these issues and they can talk about the law, whether it's on the state side or the federal side, of how they can protect trade secrets and give examples of how that has been done.
So I think you guys can do a much better job of messaging the assurances that you can give. Let me give you another example, real life. I'm not going to use any names, and the two of you might even be able to guess what these situations are, where an entity, I know, calls your office, all right, and they say, we know that we've been hacked, all right, and the government agencies say, well, we don't want you to do anything about the hack. We want to figure out where it's coming from. And the entity says, wait a minute. Valuable information, all right, that really relates to third parties where we're entrusted with that information is leaving the company and we can watch it leave. Now, we can shut this thing down, but what you're saying is no. Let the theft continue for a few more days so we can figure out more about where it's going. You can hear the gears grinding, can't you? Okay? And that's a very, very difficult situation. You want them to continue to let the fraud continue. They're going, oh my God, when our clients find out we knew about the fraud and we let their secret communications leave because the government was hoping to find who was doing it, and we don't even know the government then will be able to do anything about it, we're going to have hell to pay with them. How do we deal with that?
You deal with it like you deal with every other area of law enforcement long before there were computers. I mean, there are times when people, are having, there's theft of clothing from a store, and it's happening on a regular basis. And a natural inclination for law enforcement is to suggest a plan whereby you balance interests. And one interest is in catching the bad guy, so they don't keep stealing stuff from you and stealing stuff from other people. And it gets more serious when you're talking about violence and you're talking about people who are shooting. And you're balancing that against actually allowing ongoing harm to happen. And it depends on what the ongoing harm is. It depends on the ways in which you can protect the information. It depends on whether or not you can maybe send out decoy information. It depends on the particular facts of the case. What I a little bit don't understand is why companies, unlike other folks, don't think of these things in the same way that ordinary people were in the bygone time, which is they should have some interest in wanting to hold accountable the people who have just ripped them off and have just caused harm to their customers. I mean, I give the example often of a bank robbery that now happens through the internet, and we brought cases along these lines, like the one we talked about with the Gozi virus last week. In the old days, no bank would ever think twice about immediately calling up law enforcement. In fact, might even have panic buttons at the bank if there was a traditional robbery of funds of customers with a note and a mask and a gun. And yet sometimes the exact same thing is happening over the internet, and in fact to the tune of greater amounts of money being taken out, and they think we can sweep it under the rug and not tell anybody. The same thing that motivated people in the first instance to make sure that you get the bad guy and you don't have to worry about future break-ins, should also motivate people on the second. Obviously, it's not a perfect analogy, and there are reasons why you need to be sensitive.
Actually,
but that
it's a
discussion-
great analogy.
It's a
buttons. You
beautiful
stole
analogy,
buttons.
and part of the point there also is, some famous person said that you can divide the world into two groups. Those that know they've been hacked and those that don't know they've been hacked.
It's Richard Clark, I think.
Right,
Right.
right.
That's exactly right.
And so, I mean, part of it is we've got to also just, all of us come to terms with reality, and which is that it's happening. And so if we treat it as though the one company that gets hacked is somehow, substandard and has been compromised in an abnormal way, it's actually probably not true.
So one of the challenges
And so it's the
is
stigma.
how equipped is the government to investigate and prosecute cyber? We know that if somebody breaks into a bank wearing a stocking, all right, over their face with a gun, all right, that the government can go out and get this guy. But suppose somebody tries to break into the bank electronically, or somebody's trying to lift, valuable trade secret information, or trying to break into the infrastructure. How equipped is the government to investigate and prosecute the cyber crimes? How much confidence can people have that if we call you, something real will happen?
Well, nothing's going to happen if you don't make the phone call.
True.
And the more time that elapses, the harder it is to get the person, just like in the traditional robbery case. If you wait, 6 weeks to say there was a bank robbery, the trail runs cold. And so, the confidence will be increased if you give information immediately. It also happens to be the case that these hackers and the people involved in the Gozi virus, specifically, which we keep referring to because it's a recent vintage out of our office, they don't just attack one. And so imagine, there are 30 banks or financial institutions that are victimized, and none of them say anything to anybody, and the first time they do is 7 weeks after the fact. If everybody came forward at the same time, you develop patterns and you develop appreciation of the footprints that are left, because the cyber criminals are really, really good, but they're not perfect and they make mistakes. And the more data you have to figure out what the trail is, the more likely you're going to be able to get them. And as to your question about whether or not they're equipped, they're getting better every day. Do they have a long way to go? Yes. And I think if you had an FBI representative here or a Secret Service representative here, they would tell you the same thing. What I do know is that during the 3.5 years that I have been the United States Attorney, the number of people who have been dedicated to this at the FBI in particular has increased by orders of magnitude. Mm-hmm. And the intelligence of those people and the sophistication of those people has increased commensurately. And that is, I think, what should happen, and I think it'll get better as we go forward.
And just as a follow-up to that point, it's an age-old concept in prosecution, which is there's a very big difference between knowing a crime has happened and being able to prove a crime has happened. And what your question is also getting at is that victim is going to want to know that if they report, there will be a consequence and accountability. Well, we're going to have to prove it in court with evidence. It will not just happen. There will not be consequence and accountability because something bad happened. It will be because we proved it with evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. And so that, again, is that just to highlight Preet's point about we all know that in crime, in the traditional criminal case, the best evidence you can get is within 72 hours. After that, it is incrementally becoming cold. The case is becoming cold. So it is about picking up that phone immediately when you know it's happened. It is about sitting down with an investigator to be able to go through the evidence and sharing the evidence so that it can be proved. And as with many other cases, once you get a few of those good big cases and you bring them to court and there is consequence and accountability, like the cases that Preet has had, where the offender doesn't come to court and just write a check. They come to court with their toothbrush. Then you're going to see some changes, or at least there's going to be a greater deterrence. And so that's part of the point as well, which is what we can do with consequence and accountability right now to create prevention of later harm.
So when we talk about prevention, you can also think about prevention occurring within the corporate sector itself. You guys have already hinted at the question of corporations having to take greater responsibility. From your perspective, who should be responsible for this at a particular company or business? Who should be thinking about overall cyber threat and responsive strategies? Is this a job for the IT department? Is it a job for the chief technology officer? Is this something the CEO should do? Is this something for the board of directors? Who should own this issue and how?
Everyone, from the CEO down to, the intern who's here for the summer, who doesn't get paid but has a fabulous experience. Everyone. That's how I treat my interns.
Wait, so if you've got your interns in charge,
we're going to have to talk about that.
well, two things. Number one, I want to be an intern.
Right, exactly. But everyone, because, so for example, back to the point about the different entry points. There is, the entry points include everyone's mobile device. And if that intern has a company-issued mobile device, or through their mobile device they have access to information, they are a potential weak link. And so everyone has to be held responsible and accountable in the chain. And then, as a result, let's make sure we train everyone. Let's make sure everyone understands the role they play and their importance. Obviously.
So everyone is a potential threat because everyone's a point of entry, but not everyone can be equally responsible for figuring out the corporate strategy.
Sure.
Yeah, but I think what she's saying is everybody needs to take responsibility for what they do and to be thinking about the problem globally. I think the biggest problem in corporate America on this issue is, for whatever reason, because it's alien and because it is, people have some trepidation about learning technology and there's a generational divide, people think of the cyber threat as something different from any other kind of corporate risk. And in talking to people about this, I agree with the folks who say that any corporation, whether it's a gigantic corporation or it's just a pizza place, which also maintains people's private data and credit card information, they have to think about it as they would think about any other risk to the corporation. It's a corporate governance matter, and any other material and potentially in this area, catastrophic risk that a company might face because it's not prepared would never be outsourced to a bunch of folks in an IT department or some other subspecialty of the company. It is something that the board of directors would have to be taking direct responsibility for, making sure there was a plan. The CEO needs to take responsibility, and it has to be dealt with in that way, not just as something that the IT folks have to deal with. And the second thing I would say is amplifying what Kamala was saying a second ago, is not everything requires an expenditure of $1 billion to make sure that you are impenetrable from cybercrime. Sometimes there are simple measures, and it almost seems cliche and trite to say that these things matter and these things work, but it's true. And to use another analogy, because I like analogies today, apparently, it used to be the case that people didn't understand how to stop infection, and doctors in the old days came up with all sorts of techniques that ended up making the patient more sick than they would otherwise be. And then people realized that one of the best ways to keep people from getting infection and survive and not die, even after a successful operation, was to wash their hands. Hand washing was one of the greatest lifesavers, in medicine in recent times. And in a similar way, even though we're talking about things that can be catastrophic to a company, the age-old pieces of advice that you get about making sure you don't email from your work account to your personal account, making sure that you have a strong password, making sure that people understand that they're not supposed to open spam email. And the whole Gozi virus, which infected millions of computers and caused tens of millions of dollars in losses, was done sort of in the cyber time period the old-fashioned way. People opened up, didn't pay attention to the advice they always get from their IT people, and they didn't pay attention to the admonishment, and they opened up an email that they didn't know who sent, and they opened up the spam folder, and then a PDF file was opened, and that created a key logging virus on their computer that waited until they went to an e-banking site and literally copied down their banking credentials so they could go into the banks and take their money. And so sometimes it's things that the CEO has to deal with as an overall strategy, but simple things on the part of everyone from the interns on up have to learn also.
Yeah. So we're basically at the end of our time for the presentation. We want to leave some time for Q&A from the audience. So if there are questions from the audience, we'd be grateful for people to step on down to the microphone. We've got our parade beginning over here. So let's start from the left.
Thank you. I'm a local prosecutor for the past 30 years in Santa Clara County, and my techie friends are asking me about the Aaron Schwartz case, talking about trust and prosecutorial discretion, and we want aggressive prosecutions, but just like in old-fashioned crimes, mitigation and things like that. Can you comment on that?
That's a case, obviously, it's tragic what happened to him, and anybody who has any feeling in their body and in their heart feels bad for his family and what happened there. That's a case that I don't know the details about. It was brought by a colleague of mine in Massachusetts who I know and is a fine prosecutor and a career prosecutor, and I wouldn't comment on prosecutorial decisions made in another district like I would hope and respect other people wouldn't make about decisions that I've made. I can speak generally about how I think prosecutors should act and how I hope the people in my office act, as with anything else, whether it's in the cyber area or it's in the narcotics area or it's in the public corruption area or the insider trading area, or you name it, that prosecutors who have immense discretion need to take certain things into account and don't always have to take the law to its full effect. If every prosecutor did that all the time, that wouldn't be a country that people would want to live in. And among the things that you take into account, and again, I don't know anything about the details of that case, but generally speaking, I hope people have confidence that prosecutors pay attention to, as you do, I know, being a career prosecutor, pay attention to things like what the level of harm that was done, what the motivation of the individual was who was perpetrating, something that was a transgression of a statute, whether or not that person had personal gain, or whether or not that person was doing it for motivations that may have been misguided, but otherwise, broke the law. I mean, all those things you take into account. You sometimes take into account how you resolve the case, as facts come to light over time. And so I don't know exactly what transpired there. I understand that there's strong feeling about it, but I'm not sure that all the facts are out. And all I can say is that in the narcotics area, for example, we don't have the time and energy to prosecute all the cases that we could possibly prosecute. I have concurrent jurisdiction with the DA's office, and I am able to, under the statute, have prosecutors in my office pick people up for selling dime bags on the street. We typically, we don't do that because that wouldn't be a good use of federal resources. We typically try to go after very significant narcotics dealers, and often go after narcotics dealers who are trafficking in gigantic quantities of cocaine and heroin from around the world. And so that's how generally I think you want prosecutors, particularly in the federal area, to make their decisions.
Kamala?
Yeah, I agree with everything Preet said. It's tragic. And I don't have any knowledge, and you'll appreciate this as a prosecutor, we all do. I have no idea what the evidence was. I only know what I've read in the press, like most of us here. But it is tragic, and I have to believe that, as we go forward, there will be a better understanding of just for the general public, a better understanding of the role of the criminal prosecutor on these cases. What is the value of these cases? And to the extent that this is a technology that is at its core about innovation, and to the extent that we are still very much probably in the infancy of where this industry and this technology will go, I think everyone in every sector has got a very steep learning curve around what it means and what value then we will place on it on every level. And but it's tragic.
I'd add that I think it's extraordinarily important that those of us, here at Stanford, and those of us particularly in positions of responsibility at Stanford, contemplate deeply what occurred there and think very carefully about how we might respond in similar circumstances. I think it's very important that we try to educate ourselves about what MIT was thinking, why the institution reacted the way that it did. Clearly, what we now know is that the information that was taken is now going to be provided for free. JSTOR is going to do exactly what Mr. Schwartz always argued that it should be doing. And one can understand, I don't know if the right word is irony, or the irony combined with the sadness of a situation where, it turns out that as a practical matter, Mr. Schwartz was correct and was being prosecuted for making a point politically. And I also used to be a prosecutor at the SEC. I also used to, authorize enforcement actions. And, sometimes you get something that clearly is a technical violation of the law, but you stop and you look at it, as Preet observed, and you say, you don't have to prosecute every violation you find. And the other observation, which again is a very difficult one for an organization, when you're responsible for a third party's information, for example, the JSTOR information, and you sign a contract, and somebody is taking it in a way that's unauthorized, you also have to worry about your institution's reputation with people who are entrusting their information to you. So you have multiple different obligations that you're trying to balance. And it would be very easy for us at Stanford to wind up being put in the same situation. And I think we do need to reflect on that seriously and deeply. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank both of you for your dedicated public service. I think it's wonderful that we have people who are spending time on this and who are sort of in the front lines protecting us. And I want to ask a question and give a concrete example, and actually it's for all three of you. Preet, you spoke about the issue of trust, and I think that's absolutely right, but Joe just spoke about conflicting duties. And I've been advising clients about this for at least a decade. And conflicting duties is foremost in their mind. And you talked about how this is maybe a board issue, and I agree with that. Maybe an audit committee issue, and I agree with that. And the SECs begin to hint that maybe it is. The problem is corporations don't have a duty to the public, such as you're suggesting, that trumps their duty to their shareholders. And you know, when they're the authors of the technology, they truly believe that they have the best solution in-house, or at least better than they might have if they lose control. And I just want to read a headline to you that came out today and just get your comments on the specific problem, if not the specific example, because you may not be able to comment on this. But last week, the Department of Homeland Security did something that I thought was extraordinary. They basically issued a warning to the public saying disable Java. And today I see a headline in the Register: Oracle fesses up, Java security flaws more than storm in a teacup. The issue of trust is foremost there. The issue of conflict of duties is foremost there. That is an excellent corporation with an excellent board of directors and excellent lawyers advising them. I'm not one of them, so. The Department of Homeland Security basically outed them. And maybe there are good reasons, but there's a huge conflict there, and I'd just like to get your thoughts on this and how these kind of things get resolved.
Well, the professor answered this one.
Thank you. Well, first, just by way of full disclosure, Java was a product of Sun. Sun was acquired by Oracle. I used to be a director of the Oracle Corporation. I left the Oracle board before Oracle acquired Sun. So I have no knowledge, all right, of what's going on in that situation, but I don't want anybody, to think otherwise. Just about every major system can be hacked, all right? There are security flaws in, I don't want to name specific programs and the like, because people then be hacked off at me for mentioning specific programs, and they'll say, yeah, okay, we've got a couple of problems, but they're worse and you didn't mention them. So if I were to name specific programs where I know, all right, that there are flaws and the like, I'll only antagonize people and unfairly, draw attention. But we all now know that, there are issues with Java. And then the really interesting question, for Oracle and for the public authorities is, well, what do we do about that? And clearly, it's extraordinarily rare for the Department of Homeland Security to say, disable Java. Now, let me do an experiment. How many of you in this room know that you've got Java running on any of your computers? How many of you know that you have Java running and even knew that the warning came out? All right, so we've got about half. How many of you knew that the warning came out and did nothing and did not disable Java? Okay, a reasonable number, and this is a fair, in the great scheme of things, this is about as sophisticated an audience as you're going to get, unless you go to a faculty meeting over at the computer sciences department, where they probably go, Java, we would never touch it. Are you kidding?
This is a group of people who gave up their Wednesday evening to come here and talk about cyber.
That's exactly right.
So it should have been 100%.
These people have no life, okay? Now, what's really intriguing is you would think, all right, oh, and by the way, the vast majority of people with Java running have no idea that Java is running. They're totally clueless. You tell them that, you got to disable your Java now. It's a huge threat. Your bank account will be gone. They'll go, what do I do? You know, do I take a hammer to my computer? What do I do? All right, and by the way, and if you look at the instructions for disabling Java, you know, you might as well suggest that people perform brain surgery on themselves.
A lot of people just turned off their coffee machines.
That's exactly right. And so this is another example of where there's a problem, and the government, I can't think of anything better for the government to do under those circumstances than issue that warning and look at how ineffective, all right, that is, and that explains how terribly difficult it's going to be for us to respond to these issues. Yes, sir.
Hey, Joe. So we've talked a lot about cybercrime, and every other sentence was about banking and creating the flaw or the exploitable element, if you will, for this cybercrime to propagate, like a virus. And it is a pandemic of sorts of its own making. And so, you know, I've post 9/11, I was at the command center, I saw lots of innovation that otherwise wasn't allowed to happen in New York City under Giuliani or anyone. But suddenly it could happen. Post Hurricane Sandy, we'll see lots of things in New York City that normally in the run of day wouldn't happen. I'm also aware that DOD and their DOJ colleagues have a warfighter for the future place where they say, well, how much could we Velcro on a soldier before they just can't run into the battlefield, even though the next sensor would be wonderful? What are we doing to have a safe space for the regulators, the bankers, the bank technologists, the bank innovators, and ultimately folks who have to deal with cyber? Where did they get together to talk about not only reducing the threat, but also, you know, some of the infrastructure frailties? And just to own up to my own agenda, it's some of us in engineering that way. This is policy on this side of campus, and that's like the makers and doers over there. And we're thinking like banking is a design flawed problem of minting money. It seems sort of obvious, but over there. And wonder if we could create an institute where we start to prototype some of this stuff. And then we test it out in an actual commercially licensed bank so that everybody sees the precedent and sees that it's all good, and get the bank regulators who supervise and authenticate bank technology to say, yeah, that works. But be that as it may, whether it's here or any other place, is there a safe space for people to get around before taking Preet's lead, before there's a problem, to do the prophylaxis, to see how the systems could be built without so much propensity to be cyber hacked?
You said a lot of good stuff there. I think that not everything can be the province of prosecutors. You know, our job is to bring cases that we can bring beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury and convict people who are guilty of crimes. It is also the case that we can spend some time talking about simple steps that people can take to, you know, in connection with prevention. And you tell people, in the same way you tell people to lock their doors at night so they're not robbed. You tell people to use strong passwords. You tell people not to open up emails, like I was talking about a few minutes ago. But ultimately, I think that a piece of the puzzle, this is way above my pay grade and outside my pay grade and outside my bailiwick, is the kinds of things that you were talking about. That particularly here, and one of the reasons I'm pleased to be here is, you know, technology is part of the solution as well. And in a part of the country that has a well-deserved reputation for being the most innovative and technologically advanced in the country, if not the world, that it would be great if people took the lead there and started to spend some time thinking about how they could apply that excellence and that, you know, penchant for innovation to help guard the country against this threat. And so I would urge you to write your congressman. I would urge you to, joking aside, I think there has to be that conversation. I think that is happening at some level, but that's not something that a United States attorney necessarily is going to be taking the lead on, or even a state attorney general. That's something that happens as a policy matter, perhaps within the Department of Homeland Security and other places. But I as a private citizen, not speaking as a U.S. attorney, I wholeheartedly endorse the idea that there should be the smartest people who are outside of law enforcement and who are engineers and who are scientists and who are technically innovative and able people thinking about ways to solve the problem as well.
Yeah, I think that that's mostly true, but I would say that there is a responsibility, I think, that government has, and that especially elected leaders have, to understand that the power that we have, I see my role as having three parts. There's the constitutional responsibility and the technical responsibilities of the job. There is the bully pulpit that comes with the office, and there is the power to convene. And on particular, I think that last piece of it, we don't do it as much as we should. And on this issue in particular, there is much more room for growth and opportunity. The work that my office did with the industry around the mobile apps and privacy policies was absolutely a function of that. And you mentioned that in the introduction. We got on the phone and we called the folks who are doing this work and said, let's come in and let's sit down and figure out how we can devise something that we don't do as often as we should, which is an industry-government collaboration and solution to a problem. And we came up with one. And I think that there's much more room for that. And frankly, I believe strongly that the solutions to the problems we faced as it relates to technology are not going to develop organically within government. Because frankly, I just think that we're just not up on the curve. It's going to have to be lateral. It will have to be because the best and the brightest from the technology industry, from corporate governance come together with us to create real solutions. Because the solution will look like something that is going to be a combination of protocols that are part of governance among the industry, within the industry. It's going to be a legislative component, and then there's going to be the component that is about prosecution and which laws we choose to enforce and with what kind of vigor and priority.
We're coming towards the end of our allotted time, so we'll have time for maybe one, maybe at most two more questions.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. Thank you all very much. My name's Matt. I'm a 3L. And I want to talk a little bit about disclosure. I should say I'm writing a paper, Professor Griffiths is helping, on SEC mandated disclosure of cybersecurity breaches. Because one way you get disclosure is, of course, to compel it. And there's been some discussion of having the SEC do more of this. And they have a disclosure guidance that they issued in October of 2011. But I've been reading these disclosures, and they're like these mealy-mouthed nonsense disclosures. And so my first question is, do you think you need something like a bit more robust or specific to be mandated under the securities laws that would require them to bring material non-public information to the market? And the second is, you mentioned earlier airline litigation. And that actually got me thinking because, a big concern with disclosure among corporations is litigation costs. Zappos.com, litigation costs. Zappos.com, where I bought these amazing desert boots, they were hacked and they lost 24 million user accounts, and they were immediately hit with multiple class actions that are ongoing in the District of Nevada. Do you think, like airline litigation, there should be litigation caps or federal laws that basically make it safer for them to conduct commerce that might result in some sort of disclosure or breach, I should say?
With respect to the first thing, the second thing first, which is easier for me to dodge. I'm not at liberty to talk about what I think changes in the law should be. I think reasonable people could come to the conclusion that given the nature of the threat, that you need to come up with creative ways to limit exposure if you're going to get to the root of the problem. But I don't have an opinion on that because I don't have an opinion on a lot of things because I'm not allowed to. With respect to the publicly, I have a lot of opinions myself as a thinking person.
Between you and me.
With respect to the first part, look, no guidelines are perfect. That's why they're guidelines. And I don't necessarily agree with your characterization of them as mealy-mouthed and some other pejorative terms that you used. I do think it's interesting that the SEC chose, to come out with guidance in the first place because it was thinking ahead. and it realized that this is an issue that is of some concern to general counsels of companies and outside counsels to companies. My sense is, from speaking to people at the SEC, and we had a symposium in New York where we talked about some of these issues, and we had Rob Khuzami, the outgoing enforcement director, talk about some of these issues, that these are guidelines. I mean, I think he would admit himself that guidelines are evolved based on what people's experiences are and based on what decisions people have to make based on what those guidelines are. And I assume that they will be improved over time. But you got to start somewhere. And I'm also not in a position to dictate to the SEC the particular ways in which they might change those guidelines. I think there's an opportunity for that to be looked at again when with any luck, Mary Jo White, my former boss and estimable former United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, takes over as chair if she is confirmed. But I think you're right to raise these issues and talk about it, and it's a useful thing for people to talk about.
Last question.
So he was actually here before me. I'm going to yield to him in the hope that
That's
Ms. Harris will give me a few
extraordinarily
minutes after we adjourn.
You're a true gentleman.
Thank you. Hi, thank you both for being here. I'm a fellow here at the law school at the Center for Legal Informatics, so this interests me quite a bit. And I have to confess, in a prior life, which I managed to somehow survive, I've met your office, Attorney General Harris, in court. And the reason why...
And you're still standing.
I'm still standing, and the case is still ongoing, so you should be aware.
Are those from Zach?
So the issue is very much related to all of this. It's specifically about the financial industry and credit cards and security. And the way it came about was that I created a payment system that I thought was more safe than credit cards, more secure. And then a new law went into effect here in California, and actually New York. The banking department recently strengthened its law as well. And basically, the Money Transmission Act has made it effectively impossible for startups to compete in any way with the credit card industry and the banks. And so, and it should also be mentioned that this law was written by those industries, in fact, one particular lawyer at Morrison Forrester. So I guess my question is, there's obviously a commitment you have to uphold the law that the legislature passes, and you also need to partner with industry, in this case, really the banks. But there's also, I think, a need to upgrade infrastructure, and part of the way that gets done, I think, as one or both of you mentioned, is outside of government. So how is your office allowing startups to do that? Because from my experience, I'm still waiting on a judge to rule whether or not startups can. And in the meantime, I'm here, but I'd rather be improving the payment industry. So what gives?
Well, yeah. I mean, first of all, I applaud your creativity and the innovation, and there's no question that technology is changing long-standing business models, and there is resistance to that change, as there usually is to any change. And so there is some adaptation that needs to happen, as adoption also needs to happen of technology. And I think that in that context, we're all living in a very exciting time, where it's very exciting, because we right now, all of us, are a part of how this thing is actually going to look 20 years from now. I think of it as there was the creation of fire and the wheel and electricity and technology. It's a game changer. There's no question. And so right now we're figuring out on all of these issues that we've discussed this evening, how are we going to adopt, and what is each of our role as individuals, as government, as corporations. And so the short answer is that there are going to be bumps and there are going to be frustrations along the way. We're going to test the old models as we test the new models. And eventually, I'm very optimistic that we're going to come out in the right place where, as my comments were when we began, where we have the right balance and an appropriate balance that embraces the innovation and at the same time makes sure that vulnerable people are kept safe.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are beyond our allotted hour. I'd like to thank you so very much for spending the evening with us. You've been a great audience. And if we could have a round of applause for our guests.